Okay, so let's unpack this whole thing. Family duty, right?
Mhm.
Respect for elders.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that sort of resonates everywhere, doesn't it? Across cultures, across
It
time.
connects us back, to our roots, to the people who came before us. It feels pretty universal.
But what happens when that kind of deep cultural practice, honoring family and ancestors, actually clashes with, say, religious beliefs?
That's exactly it. That's where things get really complex and sometimes really difficult for people.
Yeah, you find some incredibly profound uh, human dilemmas there. When tradition pulls one way and faith pulls another, people face tough choices.
Definitely. And today we're taking a deep dive into a really powerful example of this. We're looking at the intersection of Confucian, filial piety, and the Christian faith.
Right. And we're focusing quite a bit on Korea, where this tension is, well, it's been very strongly felt.
But we'll also bring in some context from China and Japan too, just to get the wider picture.
And our main source here, our guide, is an academic study from the University of Pretoria. It really lays out the landscape for us.
So our mission today is basically to pull out the key insights from that material.
Yeah, we want to understand the history behind it all, get a grip on the theological friction points.
And maybe see how people have actually practically tried to handle this tension in their lives.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. The foundations. Confucianism and Confucius himself. We hear the name a lot, but what's the core of his teaching that's relevant here?
Well, Confucius, born way back, 551 BC in the state of Lu, he had royal lineage, but the source makes a point that he didn't really see himself as, like, creating something brand new.
Ah, interesting. So more like passing things on.
Yeah, exactly. More like a transmitter. That's the word the source uses.
Mhm.
Refining and passing down ancient wisdom, ancient guidelines, but making them accessible.
And he did something pretty groundbreaking for his time, didn't he? Education-wise.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He was apparently the first teacher, at least in Chinese history, known to actually offer education to common people.
Wow. So not just the elite.
Right. Broke that mold. And his main educational principles were all about cultivating the person and fostering harmony.
Like what specifically?
Things like self-discipline, harmony in the home, domestic harmony-wise government, and then ultimately kind of universal peace.
Okay, and that idea of domestic harmony, harmony in the home, that feels like a natural lead into filial piety, Shao,
That's
right?
precisely. Shao is, well, it's probably the most fundamental virtue in Confucian thinking.
Really? That's central.
Yeah, it's seen as essential for developing, good character in people.
Yeah.
And that individual goodness then kind of ripples outward.
Ripples out to the family.
That's the family, to society, even to how the government should function.
Mhm.
The source uses some really powerful descriptions for it.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Calls it the constant doctrine of heaven, the natural righteousness of earth, and the practical duty of man.
Whoa. So it's seen as, like, built into the universe and our basic human job.
Pretty much, yeah. It's considered fundamental to the cosmic order and our responsibilities within it.
So it's definitely not just a suggestion, it's a core duty. How do we know the specifics, like how this duty actually plays out?
Well, there are key texts, like the Xiaoqing, which literally means the Book of Filial Piety,
Okay.
and the Book of the Analects of Confucius. These lay out the ideals
Right.
and give guidance on, the practical ways to actually live out filial piety.
And crucially, for what we're talking about today, in Korea and in Confucianism generally, this idea of filial piety, it's really tightly connected with ancestor worship, isn't it?
That's a key point the source makes, absolutely. Ancestor worship isn't seen as some separate thing. It's considered a direct, totally accepted expression of filial piety.
So the duty to honor your parents doesn't just stop when they pass away.
Nope. It continues. You continue honoring them by venerating them as ancestors.
Right. Okay, let's dig into that practice itself then. Confucian ancestor worship. What does it actually involve?
According to the source, it involves different kinds of worship, sometimes direct, sometimes indirect, aimed at deceased parents or ancestors.
And it's usually done by the family.
Typically, yeah, by kinship groups, the living family members. And it all stems from this core belief that the soul, keeps existing after death,
Okay.
and that the living family and the dead family members can actually maintain a kind of spiritual relationship.
So the dead are still sort of active members of the family unit. In a way.
That's the belief, yes.
Yeah.
There's this idea that a dead person's spirit can become a shen. You could kind of think of it as a deified ancestor.
A shen, Like a protective spirit.
Sort of, yeah. A kind of protective spirit, or maybe a minor deity within that family structure. And these Shen are believed to stay essential to the family's well-being, maybe bringing blessings, protection.
Hmm.
There's even a belief mentioned that the spirit actually comes back to the ritual place, to eat the food that's offered during the ceremony.
Wow, partaking of the food. That really drives home the idea of a continuing relationship, a presence.
It does.
What about the rituals themselves? Are there specific things people do?
The source talks about a procedure that can have like up to 10 steps, so it can be quite involved.
10 steps. Yeah.
Yeah, things like bowing deeply in front of an ancestral tablet. That tablet is seen as like a symbolic image, a resting place for the soul you can't see.
Right.
Burning incense is common, burning paper money at the shrine, and offering various sacrifices, often large amounts of special sacrificial foods.
And this happens regularly.
Yeah, multiple times a year, usually tied to important dates like Chinese New Year or the Qingming Festival.
It sounds very elaborate and really woven into the year's rhythm. Did it always look exactly like this, though?
That's an interesting point the source brings up. Some specific things, like the burning of incense, candles, and paper money. Those were apparently added later,
No.
after Buddhism came into the picture. And the source suggests these additions maybe distorted the original Confucian meaning a bit
How so?
by linking the rituals more to the idea of helping the dead person get into a Western paradise, which wasn't really the original Confucian idea.
I see. And you mentioned earlier something about different kinds of gods in Confucianism.
Yeah, just briefly. The source touches on categories of gods linked to heaven, earth, and humans. And it says the god of humans is where ancestor worship originates, tying it back to venerating human ancestors.
Okay, so we have this really rich, deep cultural practice. It's all built around honoring family. It extends into ancestor worship, and it's seen as this fundamental duty. Now, let's pivot to the Christian side. How does Christianity define worship? And what's its take on death and the afterlife?
Right. So if we look at the Christian perspective, worship is fundamentally about attributing ultimate worth.
Ultimate worth.
Yeah. And for Christians, that ultimate worth belongs to God and God alone. It's not directed at saints, definitely not at dead people. The source calls it a spiritual transaction,
Yeah.
directly between God and the believer.
And has it always been understood that way?
Pretty consistently, yes. If you look at the Old Testament, worship was very clearly prescribed by God. And it was unique at the time because Israel's God was understood as the only God.
Right, a personal God of the covenant.
Exactly. And worship specifically did not involve idols representing other gods.
Mm.
The whole focus was on glorifying God.
Okay. And then in the New Testament, how is worship talked about there?
Well, the New Testament uses terms like proscunium, which is quite vivid. It means something like to fall to the knee before.
Wow.
It's worship done in spirit and truth, happening wherever Christians gather together. And the characteristics mentioned are things like deep reverence, awe, praise, thanksgiving, humility, confession, prayer, consecration.
A whole range of expressions.
Yes, but the object is always singularly God. Specifically, the source mentions the living Christ, the Lamb who is worthy.
And who can participate? Is it limited like the kinship groups?
No, that's another key difference. Unlike the kinship focus in Confucian practice, Christian worship is open to anyone who believes in Jesus.
Okay. So right there, you can really start to see the fundamental theological difference taking shape.
Absolutely. The ultimate object of worship in Christianity is God alone, not deceased people like in ancestor worship.
And access isn't based on family ties.
Exactly. It's through faith in Christ, open to all believers, not limited by lineage or kinship. That's a really core point of divergence.
Okay. What about the Christian view of death itself? What happens to the spirit according to this understanding?
Well, the biblical view, as the source lays it out, is that death means the separation of the body and the spirit.
Okay.
Then there's what's called the intermediate state. Believers go to be in paradise, while unbelievers are in a place called Hades.
And is there interaction between these states or with the living?
The Bible, especially in a passage like Luke 16, really emphasizes a great chasm between these places. It basically prevents interaction or fellowship between living family members and those who have died.
So that idea we talked about earlier, the spirits of the dead coming back, interacting, being part of rituals.
From the biblical viewpoint described in the source, that's not possible. The spirit of someone who has died cannot return to earth, or to their family, or to these ancestor worship places. That belief just doesn't align with the Christian understanding of the afterlife.
Okay. So we've got this deep cultural root of filial piety expressed through ancestor worship in Confucianism.
Right.
And then the Christian faith, focusing worship solely on God, with a very different view of death and the afterlife. This sets up a major tension, which, as you said, has played out across Asia. Let's look at some of those historical clashes, starting with China.
Yeah, in China, this conflict popped up pretty early on with Christian missionaries. You had the Jesuits, who were generally more inclined to accommodate. They tended to see ancestor worship more as a social custom, a way of showing respect.
Kind of like a cultural thing, not necessarily religious worship.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
But then you had others, like the Dominicans and Franciscans, who strongly opposed it. They saw it as straight-up idolatry.
Hmm. Sounds like a big internal debate within the church itself. Did the Catholic Church ever take an official stance?
It did, eventually. In
Is
1939, Pope Pius XII issued a decree. It essentially allowed Catholics to participate, formally framing it as a social ceremony.
Okay, so defining it as respect for the dead, cultural education.
Exactly. Which was, a significant official difference compared to how many Protestants viewed it.
And the Protestants, what was the general feeling there?
Well, many Protestant missionaries, like Hudson Taylor from the China Inland Mission, were very much against it. They saw it clearly as idolatry and opposed participation.
Okay. How did this tension manifest in Taiwan?
Taiwan saw a similar kind of struggle. And the source actually suggests that this whole issue might have contributed to, well, a lower rate of Christian conversion there.
Really? Why?
Partly because non-Christians sometimes got the impression that Christians didn't care about their ancestors, that they were disrespectful, which obviously created a negative image for the church.
That makes sense. A misunderstanding of motives.
Yeah, and there's still the debate going on there today between trying to maybe adapt the practice, like creating a Christian memorial service, versus rejecting it entirely as idolatry.
Still wrestling with it. And Japan.
In Japan, ancestor worship is really deeply woven into both Shintoism and Buddhism. It makes it a major obstacle for Christian evangelism.
How so?
Yeah.
What do the practices look like there?
Well, they often center around family graves, called bosan, and also household altars, known as butsudan. Plus, there are various festivals throughout the year.
Okay.
And there's this belief that the spirit of the person who died kind of grows or evolves after death. It moves towards becoming an ancestor spirit, a sore, and eventually might even become a kami.
A kami, like a divine being.
Sort of, yeah, a type of divine being or spirit in the Shinto tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And Japanese Christianity, for the most part, really rejects that kind of blending, that dual religious identity.
Right. These examples definitely show a consistent pattern of conflict across the region. Which brings us back to Korea, where, as you said, the tension seems especially strong.
It really does. The source emphasizes how strong Confucian influence still is in Korea. It mentions a survey by someone named Ryu,
Okay.
which found that almost 75% of Korean Christian families reported having significant problems with their relatives, specifically over ancestral rites.
75%. Wow, that's huge. That really shows how personal and widespread this is.
It really does. The source calls it a big syncretistic challenge for the church in Korea.
Can you share some of the specific examples from the source, the ones that really illustrate this tension?
Sure. There's one case about a man. It's called Mr. Kim. He's the firstborn son.
Which carries specific responsibilities in a Confucian context, right?
Exactly. Traditionally, the firstborn son has the main duty of performing the ancestral rites, which happen multiple times a year. But his wife is described as a conservative Christian who sees these rituals as idolatry.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. So this creates intense conflict every year with his brothers who aren't Christian. It apparently puts a huge strain on their family relationships.
You can just imagine the pressure year after year.
Absolutely. Then there's another example involving a funeral. Mr. Kim's family. His grandmother passed away. She was part of a strongly Confucian family that practiced ancestor worship regularly.
So conflict was almost inevitable at the funeral.
It sounds like it, yeah. Because of the different beliefs about what rituals were necessary or acceptable, and there's even a divorce case mentioned. One of the reasons cited for the divorce was that the wife didn't visit her father-in-law's house very often, and crucially, didn't help prepare for the ancestor worship ceremonies.
Wow, that really shows how deeply embedded these cultural expectations are tied to filial piety and how they impact modern life, even marriage.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
These aren't just abstract theological issues. They cause real hurt and division in families.
So let's trace this back a bit in Korea specifically. What are the historical roots of this particular conflict?
Well, when the Roman Catholic Church first got started in Korea around 1784, the very first converts, like a man named Peter Yi, faced pressure almost immediately.
Why? What was the issue?
It was precisely because they refused to participate in the Confucian ancestral rites. They were following a clarification that had come from the Pope back in 1742, which prohibited Catholics from taking part.
And this refusal, it led to trouble, persecution.
Yes, definitely. For some, it became a matter of life and death. The source tells the really striking story of Shi Cheng-yun. He's considered an early martyr.
What happened to him?
He was executed in 1791, and the specific reason was that he had buried his mother's ancestral tablet, refusing to keep it for worship.
Wow.
And apparently, before he was executed, he said something like, "He would rather do wrong to my deceased mother than to the heavenly Lord."
That's an incredibly powerful statement.
It really is. It was a clear declaration that, for him, obeying God was a higher priority than obeying his parents or even the king's orders regarding these rites.
What about later on, say during the Japanese occupation?
Right. During the occupation from 1910 to 1945, the Japanese government forced people to participate in Shinto shrine worship.
Which many Koreans would have seen
As idolatry, exactly, including both Catholics and Protestants. Many protested against it.
Did the churches hold firm?
Well, it was incredibly difficult. Some groups, like the source mentions the 27th Presbyterian General Assembly in 1938, eventually decided under intense pressure, under coercion, to allow participation.
That must have been a painful decision.
No doubt. But the source also highlights that many churches and missionaries didn't give in. They courageously kept resisting.
Are there examples of that resistance?
Yes, it points to people like Reverend Sang Dong Han, who apparently created specific codes of conduct for his followers, telling them not to participate in the shrine worship. It shows that even under extreme duress, there was continued resistance against what they saw as forced idolatry or syncretism.
This history just really underscores the deep convictions on both sides and the immense pressure Korean Christians have faced over generations. Let's circle back to the core theological issue here. Why, according to the source, is ancestor worship seen as fundamentally problematic from a Christian standpoint?
The source is very direct about it. The central issue is idolatry.
Okay. And how does the source define idolatry in this context, drawing from the Bible?
It looks at both the Old and New Testaments. In the Old Testament, idolatry is broadly understood as worshiping other gods, or images of them, like in Exodus 20, the Ten Commandments.
Right. You shall have no other gods before me.
Exactly. And it also includes specific forbidden practices, like trying to contact the dead necromancy or worshiping the dead, which is mentioned in Deuteronomy.
Okay. What about the New Testament?
The New Testament picks up on this too. Paul, for instance, in Romans 1, critiques people for worshiping created things instead of the Creator. And interestingly, in Colossians 3, he even calls greed a form of idolatry.
Greed. How so?
Because it's putting ultimate value and trust in something other than God. So the basic idea of idolatry is this strange worship, directing worship toward the wrong thing, or worshiping the true God in a way that misrepresents or dishonors him.
Got it. So, based on that definition, what specific beliefs or practices within Confucian ancestor worship does the source identify as being unacceptable for Christians?
Okay, there are several key points of direct conflict highlighted. First, Christians have to reject the belief that the spirits of dead parents or ancestors have the power to bring blessings or curses on their descendants.
Because only God has that ultimate power.
Right, only God. Second, they reject the idea that dead parents can act as mediators or reconcilers between people and God.
Because Jesus Christ is seen as the only reconciler.
Exactly. Third, they reject the belief that the spirits of the dead actually come back to earth to eat the food offered in the ceremonies.
Because the biblical view is that the dead are in a separate state, no fellowship with the living.
Correct. They exist in a different state with no possibility of direct interaction or fellowship. And finally, the sacrificial practices themselves, the cheza.
Yes.
Those are seen as idolatry because the sacrifices, the offerings are being directed to the spirits of the dead, not to God.
That lays out the theological conflict very clearly. Okay. So given this strong cultural pull to honor ancestors, which is deeply ingrained, and this clear theological barrier, seeing ancestor worship as idolatry, how do Korean Christians actually navigate this? How can they possibly honor their parents and their family heritage without doing what their faith considers worship directed away from God?
That's really the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the source does explore potential ways forward. The main suggestion revolves around finding alternative methods.
Alternatives to express what?
To express filial piety, to express family unity, acknowledging how important honoring parents is, but doing it in a way that deliberately avoids syncretism.
Syncretism meaning blending things that are seen as theologically incompatible.
Exactly. Trying to keep the expressions of honor distinct from the practices of ancestor worship.
So what kind of alternative does the source suggest?
The main one proposed is developing a specifically Christian memorial service.
Okay, a Christian memorial service, how would that be different?
Well, the focus shifts completely. Instead of offering worship to the ancestors, the focus is on remembering the deceased, celebrating their life, remembering the love and grace they showed.
So honoring their memory.
Precisely. And using the gathering as a time to strengthen the bonds among the living family members, both the Christians and the non-Christians in the family.
And the format. Is it rigid?
No, the idea is for it to be flexible. The goal is to promote peace and harmony, and importantly, to allow non-believing family members to participate comfortably without feeling rejected or forced into something they don't believe.
That sounds like a sensitive approach.
Yeah.
What might such a service actually look like? What steps might be involved?
The source suggests some possible elements, things like preparation, then a service that might include reading relevant scripture passages, prayer, maybe times for family members to share personal memories or reflections about the person who died, and then, importantly, sharing a meal together afterwards. But the emphasis is different. It's seen as fraternal communion, fellowship among the living, done in the name of God, rather than the spirits partaking of the food.
I see. So the intention isn't to compromise on the issue of worship,
Not at all.
but rather to uphold the biblical command to honor parents, finding a culturally relevant way to do that without crossing into practices deemed idolatrous.
That's exactly how it's framed. It's presented not as a compromise with ancestor worship, but as finding a genuinely biblical expression of filial piety within a cultural context that has traditionally tied that piety very closely to ancestor worship.
And are there biblical examples that Christians can point to, examples of honoring parents or elders that fit this kind of model?
Yes, the source does mention a couple, like the story of Shem and Japheth covering their father Noah's nakedness.
Right, an act of honor and respect for his dignity.
Exactly. And also the story of Ruth, showing incredible devotion and loyalty to her mother-in-law, Naomi, even after her husband died. These are held up as biblical models of honoring parents or elders that align perfectly with Christian values, and they can be expressed in ways that don't involve the specific worship elements found in the traditional rites.
So, wrapping this all up, what does this deep dive really reveal?
Well, I think it powerfully shows just how complex and, frankly, how challenging it can be for people, for individuals and families, to navigate between powerful cultural traditions and deeply held religious beliefs.
Yeah, we've certainly seen the tension, the conflict play out historically across Asia, leading to persecution, causing ongoing friction within families even today.
And we've seen how the core of that clash really boils down to fundamentally different understandings of worship, of what happens after death, and what constitutes idolatry.
But importantly, we've also seen the search for ways forward, principled ways, like the idea of the Christian memorial service. It shows people trying hard to honor both their heritage and their faith.
It really highlights the complexity of belonging, in a sense, to different worlds, different traditions at the same time.
It definitely leaves you with something to think about. How do you, listening now, reconcile the different influences in your own life, your cultural background, your family history, your core beliefs?
Yeah, what does it really mean for you to honor where you come from while also staying true to your own convictions? It shows that finding respectful, principled ways forward is possible, even if it's often really difficult.
Definitely something to chew on.